All right, we are up and running, we hope. So right now in the in Sefer Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, we are at a liminal moment. That is to say, it's a major transitional moment that you know is happening. Right? It's not subliminal, it's liminal. You're aware of it. And Moses is so aware of it that he is constantly reminding the Israelites, things are about to change. And they're changing because we're about to go into the land of Israel. And what are some of the changes that are going to happen compared to the 40 years before and that now coming into the land? What are some of those big changes? Okay, so our leader is changing.
We're going to have to work for a living.
We're going to go to Mr. Joshua. We're going to have to work. Also meaning no manna. Good?
Well, you're going to have to live in permanent places.
All right. We're going to build homes. Not that we didn't have our semi-nomadic home, but now it's actually on a plot of land, which also means...
Yes, we have to divide the land.
You have to divide it. Which means... And we're going to have to fight. We've been doing some fighting, but now we're going to do a lot more fighting. But if we're dividing the land and building homes, what does that also mean?
We're creating a nation.
We're creating a nation and expanding. That's a major thing. Right? I know these look like a whole new change of leadership. We're actually have to work rather than having manna. We're going to build our house. We're going to divide land and fight. But up until this point, for 40 years, we've all been living together. And now Judah is going to be over there, and Naphtali is going to be over there, and Ephraim is going to be over there. And even within Judah, you know, all the people of the tribe aren't going to see each other every day. When we lived in our encampment in the wilderness, pretty much you could see everybody all the time. Now, not. That's a major difference. And there's something else that comes along with that spreading out that's going to become very, very important.
Family.
Nope.
Altar. Where is it going to be?
Yeah.
You're going to have to.
We've had the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the center of our people for 40 years now. Well, 38-ish. And now it's going to be in one place, and we're going to get to where it goes eventually. But it's going to be in one place, and the rest of us are going to be quite distant from us. Right? We're not going to all live in one circle around the Mishkan. We're going to spread out over this country, which may not be large by American standards, but it's certainly large enough that you're not going to be able to pop over to the altar at the Mishkan whenever you feel like it, where we could up until this point. And that's going to cause some changes, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. Good? Good. Page 1062. We are in chapter 12 of Devarim, Parashat Re'eh. And we're just going to go ahead and start off on verse 1 of chapter 12. And I need a volunteer to read. Okay, thanks, Larry.
Okay.
Yeah, that doesn't actually have a 1 in front of it. Just these are.
These are the laws and rules that you must carefully observe in the land that the Lord, God, your fathers, is giving you to possess as long as you live on earth. You must destroy all the sites at which the nations you are to possess worship their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills, or under any luxuriant tree.
I love the phrase luxuriant tree, right? Eitzra Anan, right? This sort of overflowing tree image, which basically what they're trying to say is that when we come in and we see these sites of idolatry, even after we have fought and conquered the land, meaning that the idolaters who built them are no longer there, we are going to have to take care of that. We're going to have to not only drive them out, but we are going to have to, next verse,
tear down their altars, smash their pillars, put their sacred posts to the fire, and cut down the images of their gods, obliterating their name from that site.
We are going to have to come in and renovate the land, to be very polite about it, where these altars and sites of worship are going to have to be leveled, destroyed, because they were considered to be such a tempting trap for the Israelites that were they to be left there, we would surely have ended up worshiping at those sites as well. And it's as one rabbi explained it to me, it's like somebody who has become an alcoholic. They don't keep a liquor cabinet after they have found their way out of alcoholism. They get rid of the liquor cabinet.
Yeah, but these people have been without the liquor cabinet for 38 years.
Absolutely. And
so none of them are alcoholics.
Right. So alcoholics are usually considered to be alcoholics, even if they've been clean and sober for 38 years, 40 years. More to the point, God feels that our desire to worship is so strong, so passionate in general, which is one of the reasons why we make good candidates to be the people of Torah, that we're willing to love any form of worship. And we have almost an instinctual addiction. It's like, I remember back in the 80s and 90s when there was an epidemic with crack cocaine, where you had infants being born from their mothers with an addiction to the drug already in them. We're sort of considered like that. We have a natural disposition to finding idolatry especially enticing.
Isn't this like the Taliban knocking, destroying those, centuries old?
So first of all, we were never told, and the halakha is codified, that we do not have to pursue and destroy outside of our own borders. Secondly, we're not destroying them because we believe that they deserve to be destroyed just in and of themselves. We are destroying them because they are a snare to us. It's like if you were allergic to peanuts, like my daughter, and you come into a new house and you open up the pantry and there's a whole bunch of peanut butter, you're going to have to throw out all that peanut butter. You just can't have it in your house because for you, that is dangerous. That doesn't mean you're going to go to your neighbor's house and get rid of his peanut butter, but in your house, it's got to be peanut free. And for us, in our land, in the land of Israel, it has to be idolatrous free. Now, there are other ways that you can desanctify idols and turn them into objects merely of historical curiosity. And indeed, if you go to Israel today, you'll find in the Israel Museum and many other places artifacts that have been dug up and that are clearly not meant to be worshipped, but are used as historical interest. Those do still exist. So they're not being pulverized, but especially at this generation, for these people, they needed to remove that temptation completely from themselves. Yes, maybe? Further comments? Okay. Part 4, or verse 4 rather.
Do not worship the Lord your God in like manner, but look only to the site that the Lord your God will choose amidst all your tribes as his habitation, to establish his name there. There you are to go, and there you are to bring your burnt offerings and other sacrifices, your tithes and contributions, your votive and free will offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and flocks. Together with your households you shall feast there before the Lord your God, happy in all the undertakings in which the Lord your God has blessed you.
All right. So we are not supposed to maintain these altars and just repurpose them for God. Alternatively, we're not supposed to worship God in that same way, meaning we don't destroy God's altar the way we're destroying these idolatrous altars. But also what's being brought here is the idea that there will continue to be a point of central worship. That the Mishkan that we had in the desert is going to continue to be used as the central point of our life.
Were these the foreign altars similar to what we were putting up?
Archaeology, because we don't have a description of what the foreign altars look like in the Torah or Tanakh, but we know from archaeology, as well as other ancient texts, that there were certain similarities. So, for example, the horned altar, the fact that the altar itself had these protrusions on the corners, that we have found many examples from Canaanite worship that do bear a striking resemblance. We know that the idea of the overall structure of the temple shape is very similar to some of the other Canaanite temple shapes, the floor plan, if you will. So there's definitely some similarities, but many others that are not. Where there is greater similarity, rather than between our altar and our Mishkan and what the Canaanites were doing, which, like I said, is more conjecture, is what our ancestors had done prior to this point. Because remember, until we had the Mishkan, if Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob wanted to make a sacrifice to God, what'd they do? They went to a high place, they went to a bama, they went to an elevated spot, and they built an altar there, and they made a sacrifice. And now we're not, right? That was the ultimate do-it-yourself form of worship. And this is saying the people who were in the land would build these altars everywhere, and they would do whatever they felt like, wherever they were. We're not doing it that way. We're going to have a place that God has chosen. Now, we're going to have to walk that back in just a minute, thanks to the Midrash, but for the moment, that seems to be our surface level reading. And in fact, it gets emphasized in the next few verses.
Take care not to sacrifice your burnt offerings in any place you like, but only in the place that the Lord will choose in one of your tribal territories. There you shall sacrifice your burnt offerings, and there you shall.
I think you might have skipped a bit.
Join upon you.
Hold on. Okay, so aren't you on verse 13?
Yeah.
Right, but I think we were still on verse 8, weren't we?
Yes, I jumped.
You jumped page.
Yes.
No problem. But it is a similar theme, which is why it took me a second to recognize. But God is making his point very, very strongly. But verse 8, I want to get that. Yeah, you shall not act.
You shall not act at all as we now act here, every man as he pleases, because you have not yet come to the allotted haven that the Lord your God is giving you. When you cross the Jordan and settle in the land that the Lord your God is allotting to you, and he grants you safety from all your enemies around you, and you live in security, then you must bring everything that I command you to the site where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name.
All right, we're going to get a list again of what's brought, but we don't need to repeat that for the moment. Did we just change the rule? Because if you were reading, I don't know whether you noticed, but there was a sudden shift in what we were saying. Because in the first one, it said...
Yeah, it changes the rule.
Right.
You shall not act as...
It says there's one site, right? There's a place that God's going to pick. That's what we had on verse... what's that?
5.
Verse 5, exactly. They're going to choose a site. That's where his name will be established, and there you are to go. Boom. In verse 8, that seems to be repeated. You're not going to do it however you feel like it. But verse 9, 10, and 11 begin to give us explanation of why. And that explanation could introduce why not. Right? Because you have not come to the allotted haven that the Lord your God is giving you, which is implying that right now there's a certain rule of how we worship that is different than what the rule will be once we have reached that place, once we have actually gotten settled. And then that gets reinforced when you cross the Jordan and settle the land, and God grants you safety, and you live in security, then you must bring everything. So the question is, this one site, is this now, or is this later? Well, in verse 5, it sounded like now. When you're crossing, when you get to there,
Right.
God's going to establish his name on one spot, boom, we're done. But verses 9, 10, and 11 sound like when you settle, when you cross, when you settle, when you're secure, when you're safe, then there will be one. It sounds almost like it's contradicting itself.
It sounds as if they left the Mishkan and everything, that they didn't carry it across the Jordan with them, because they didn't know exactly where they were supposed to put it.
Well, they put it wherever they encamped. And that's also part of the issue, which is the Mishkan was a mobile shrine, and it continued to go from place to place to place as we went from place to place to place. And that meant you worshipped wherever it currently was. You wouldn't go back to, well, the Mishkan was back there yesterday, so I'm going to go back there and I'm going to make a sacrifice where the Mishkan used to be. No, you didn't do that. You went to where the Mishkan was today. But the question is, how were they doing it during that time? How are they going to do it eventually? And what happens in the meantime? And thankfully, our sages have also looked into this, and they've tried to lay things out, I hope, in a manner that will become clear. There's even a little chart down on the bottom right. So we'll get to the chart in a second, but let's get to our basic explanation. So this is mostly taken from Rashi, except where otherwise marked.
So,
do not act in this way. No, from the handout, please, Larry.
do not act in this way. Do not act this way by bringing burnt offerings for the sake of heaven anywhere except for the place God will select.
All right, so that was our original interpretation of back in verse 4, where it said you're not supposed to do like what they do. Because what they do is they do it wherever they feel like. You're only going to do it where God picks. That's our sort of basic interpretation that we already went over. However,
another interpretation, smash their altars, obliterate their names. Do not act this way. This prohibits erasing the sacred name and breaking an altar stone or a temple courtyard stone.
Right? So another way to read this as being, rather than having, as this printing does, a gap between the obliterate their sites and don't worship God, is the don't worship God comes as a semicolon after the obliterate their sites, meaning obliterate their sites, but don't do that for God. And therefore they're linked together, meaning don't destroy God's name. And this is indeed where our sages learn that it is a mitzvah not to erase God's name and not to destroy, as they go into more detail, things that are connected to the temple and connected to God. So there is another way to read that. However, that way creates a bit of an uncomfortable hypothetical, which is what Rabbi Ishmael is going to bring out.
This prohibits erasing the sacred name and breaking an altar stone or a temple courtyard stone. Rabbi Ishmael said, is it conceivable that an Israelite would smash altars?
Right? Oh, wait, really? We're worried that the Israelite is going to run up and smash the altar of the Mishkan?
Rather, do not act as they did, whereby your iniquity would cause the ruin of the temple of your forefathers.
We wouldn't expect the Israelites to actually smash the altar of the temple, but we might expect them to follow the ways of the Canaanites, which will inevitably lead to the smashing of the altar of the temple, we know historically, by the Babylonians. So no, we don't expect the Israelites to go so crazy that they also smash their own altar to God. But we do know that the temptation to idolatry might lead them down a path where eventually we will be conquered by an invading force. Then that invading force will smash the altar for us. So the smashing is still connected to the idolatry, but not in a direct thing. And indeed, Rabbi Ishmael is quite right, historically, that even at our times of greatest apostasy to God and most embracing of other idols and gods that we worship, we still offered up sacrifices at the temple. The temple kept going, and we still went there for festivals, and then we also went to other places and worshiped other gods too. So we were, like I said, we were so passionate about our worship, we just wanted to love everybody. And that is kind of what Rabbi Ishmael is saying could be here, that we might not be expected to turn on the temple itself, but our actions by fooling around with all these other idols will eventually take the temple down.
We're not completely monotheistic.
Well, we didn't always act completely monotheistic, exactly. We sometimes gave preference to God over all the other ones, much the way somebody might have their primary spouse, but then have lots of other people on the side. And then there were other times when we just sort of said, yeah, God's one of many, and we just went wherever we felt like. But we didn't destroy the temple itself. So
when when you're offering to a foreign altar, are you just using the foreign altar, or are you invoking another name? Or is that altar, in honoring someone other than the one true God, or is it?
Certainly, historically, we not only worship God at the temple, we would also go, as you'll be in other places. But when we use foreign altars, leftover altars from the times of the Canaanite gods, or new ones that we built ourselves, we were trying to honor those gods, not our actual Adonai God. So we were very pluralistic in our worship. We were very polytheistic in our worship, and that was and kind of what Deuteronomy is trying to prevent us from doing, and kind of what all the prophets later will come to tell us to stop doing. Yeah, that we were worshiping other gods at many of these other sites. But the question still remains, but what about once we've spread out, it was written there, once we've spread out, how am I going to be able to come and worship, especially while we're still in the process of conquering the land? And so that topic gets picked up in our next commentary. This one's from the Sifrei, which is one of the earliest Midrash collections.
As long as the Mishkan had not been established, the
Bamot
were permitted, and the service was performed by the firstborn. When the Mishkan was established, the Bamot were forbidden, and the service was performed by the Kohanim.
Okay, so what Sifrei is trying to explain to here is a historical progression. That the Mishkan, before it was established, you didn't have to worry about where you were supposed to do your services, because there was no place that was supposed to, that was designated. Instead, you would worship where you needed to worship, and just as there was no place designated, there were no people designated. It was simply the firstborn that would do so. And in fact, there's a number of midrashim that say this is why we have to do the redemption of the firstborn, the pidyon haben, because we are saying, if God had not picked the Kohanim to do this, the firstborn would have been stuck doing it, or gotten the honor to do it, depending upon how you want to look at it. And therefore, we're redeeming them because their service is not needed, because the Kohanim have already been pre-designated. But this notion that there was a period when the Bamot were permitted is a very important one. So prior to the construction of the Mishkan and the election of the Kohanim, you had people making their own altars, firstborns of each family doing the services, and that's what happened. Then comes the Mishkan, comes the Kohanim, and that's done. Mostly. And now we're going to have to try and continue our history. So now we're going, as you can see, sort of line by line, verse by verse, where it says that you will seek God. Where is this referring to? So we're back to the handout on verse 5, where it says, seek his presence.
This refers to the tabernacle at Shiloh.
Okay, so the tabernacle at Shiloh, the Mishkan at Shiloh, if you look on your little chart here, this is the wanderings of the altar. So we begin first without a Mishkan, right? That's where it says pre-Mishkan. And that meant the Bamot, a lofty sort of raised area where you would offer a sacrifice. That was permitted, no problem. The Mishkan in the Sinai wilderness, that was created and used while that was in operation. You could not use the Bamot, right? You had to go to the Mishkan in the middle of the encampment in order to make your sacrifices. Once we enter the land, the Mishkan, the tent is pitched at Gilgal, and it's there for about 14 years. While it's there, as we're going to see, the Bamot were allowed again. They were permitted. However, eventually the Mishkan is moved to Shiloh, and there it is fixed for 369 years. And while it's there, no more Bamot. Eventually it gets destroyed, and then the Mishkan moves to Nov and Gibeon. And while it's moving during this period of unease, the Bamot were allowed again. And then eventually David comes along and establishes Jerusalem, settles the Mishkan in Jerusalem, and then replaces it with the Beit HaMikdash, with the temple itself. And then no more bamot, ever. So that's the pattern of back and forth of when you were allowed to offer these other sacrifices in other places or not. Right now, what this is talking about in Shiloh, that was when we were back to, you can only go to Shiloh and nowhere else. That was it. But we have to uncover what happened in between Shiloh, because we know that there was a time in between, and why this would go on and off for permission. Okay, so now we're on the verse 8 commentary.
When you cross the Yarden,
that's the Jordan River,
you will be immediately permitted to bring up offerings on the personal Bama altar throughout all 14 years of conquest and division.
All right. I got to interrupt you. Yes, that's my job. So in verse 8, where we said, you'll not act as you've been acting here, everybody doing what's right in their own eyes, rather than reading that as being somehow that we've been doing something wrong, it's saying, actually, what you're going to be able to do when you cross the Yarden is make sacrifices in your own places. Because for 14 years, you're going to need to. Because what's happening during those 14 years? The conquerors, the fighting, right? So, I mean, if you are in the midst of war, then leaving your home and going to Gilgal to make a sacrifice is a little tricky. That may not be the best and wisest strategy to have people coming down to Gilgal. So during that time of conquest and division, as the land is in this first wave of settling, the sages read this section of the Torah as saying, for that window, you would be allowed to offer up sacrifices other than where the Mishkan itself was. Right? During the desert, no, you got no excuse. Even though there was some fighting, we're all together. It's right here. There's nothing you're going to be in danger by traveling. You do the sacrifices here. Once we enter, there's going to be a window where that's not really safe, and so we get special permission. However, there's a limitation.
However, on the personal Bama altar, you may not offer everything you offer here. This day at the Mishkan, which remains with you and has been anointed.
Go ahead.
This is an appropriate place for bringing sin and guilt offerings and vow and free will offerings. However, on the personal Bama, nothing may be offered except for the vow and free will offerings. This is the meaning of each what is upright in his eyes. Vow and free will offerings, which you donate because you feel it is proper to bring them and not because you must. These you may offer on a personal Bama. All
right. So again, Sifrei, which Rashi is interpreting here, does this brilliant close reading of what kind of sacrifices could you do on your own? That is to say, am I allowed to do a sin offering on one of these private bamot? No. Why? Because that's not what is right in my eyes. A sin offering is doing what I have to do because I've done something wrong in the eyes of God. But if I wanted to just make a free will offering, celebratory offering, yay, this is good, that's my choice. That's because it's right in my eyes. And those I can offer wherever I am. I don't have to leave my house and go to Gilgal to do that offering. If I have a sin offering, then yeah, I'm going to have to schlep because that's a requirement that I need to do. But if it's a voluntary offering, I could do that at any one of my own personal spots.
Is it with a sin offering something that has to be the interaction between the person who's offering and the Kohanim?
Well, there's definitely interaction, but it's not technically an interaction that couldn't be happened outside of the Mishkan precincts. But the idea, I think, that they were trying to say here is that although your voluntary offerings, there was going to be more leeway, if you needed to do something to put yourself right with God, that needed a little bit more supervision. That we want to make sure that you're doing it the correct way, because the danger of having the personal bamot, and the reason why God doesn't seem to be a fan of them in general and is only giving special case circumstances to allow them, the danger is that feels like, in sort of our first reading of doing what's right in your own eyes, drifting away from that core of Torah. And so you could still, you know, do the atonement with the animal on your own bama. The sages do not think that's something that's really such a great idea. That your own choice, your own voluntary, yay, okay, but the things you got to do those right.
I just felt that it was like a public declaration or something that needed to be more publicly announced. Or
there's an element of confessing
Yeah.
Of the sin. You know, this goat is because I did X, Y, and Z. But it isn't actually necessary to make it more public than necessary. So sometimes making a sin too public is considered to be the wrong choice, and sometimes it needs to be public in order that it make proper tshuva for whatever damage you've done. So it's sort of a case by case.
What makes it it was a lot harder if you had to go down to wherever the fishing was,
right,
as opposed to just doing it
in your backyard.
Yeah. So it was a sin offering entailed a lot more. Cost a lot.
Well, yes. I mean, at least in terms of time. And that idea of, is this making spirituality and observance harder or easier, is something that I want you to have percolating in the back of your mind. Right? Is it easier to have it available wherever you are? Or is it not such a good idea because the benefit is not going to be there the same way as if you make the effort to have to go where you're supposed to go? And that I don't want to answer just yet because we got more material to get through before we get to that point. The collection there of quotes from Genesis, those are all different places where the Avot, our ancestors, offered up sacrifices in random locations that were important to them, but not important to anyone else. But let's go on and continue with our interpretation. And now we're going to take apart verse 9.
For you will not come equals throughout those 14 years until now equals like
yet, which our translation has already basically taken care of, right? Because you have not yet come. And what Rashi is doing is what our translator already did, which is render that into a more understandable grammar. So you haven't quite come to the end of the 14 period that I'm now predicting, because then you'll get
to the rest. This refers to Shiloh.
Right. When you'll come to rest, that will be Shiloh, and that'll be for the 369 years.
And to the inheritance, this refers to Jerusalem.
And again, lovely close reading. You might have thought, I certainly would have I certainly did when I first read this, when you come to your rest and the inheritance, that sounds like one thing. But the sages are saying, well, it says rest and inheritance. That could be one thing, or it could be two things. And since there are two main places that the Mishkan came to rest, that the altar came to stand as a sort of permanent long-term spot, then the first half is referring to Shiloh, and the second half is referring to Yerushalayim. Clever sages, reading carefully. All right, verse 10, back of the page.
And he has granted you peace after the conquest and division, and peace with the nations whom Adonai allowed to remain in order to test Israel. This did not occur until the time of David.
Right, so once David came along, that's when we really achieved peace. And that then becomes what we talked about in verse 11.
Let it be that the place build for yourselves the chosen sanctuary in Jerusalem. This is as it is said concerning David. It was when the king had settled in his palace, and Adonai had granted him peace on every side from all his enemies. Then the king said to the prophet Nathan, look here, I am settled in a palace of cedar wood, while the ark of God languishes amidst curtains.
All right, so it's that the phrasing of this verse, or this passage about David, is not accidental. It is living out exactly what we see here in Re'eh in verses 9, 10, and 11, which is David finally recognizes that he's been given peace, that the country is at peace, And that means it is time to finally implement the final stage of what God had been talking about, which is building a permanent spot that will be in perpetuity the only place for sacrifices. So if we go back to our first question of, is the first half, verse 5, verses 9, 10, and 11? The answer is no. Verses 9, 10, and 11 is expanding on the shorthand version that verse 5 represents. So verse 5 says God's going to pick a place. 9, 10, and 11 says, and this is how the picking's going to work. There's going to be periods where there's peace, and there's periods where there's fighting, and period of temporary peace, and periods of more lasting peace. And during each of those periods, there's going to be different rules for how we handle the sacrifices. It's not a one-size-fits-all for that time period, because everything is going through this tumult. Make sense? Maybe? Yeah? It's more complicated than it first looks, yes?
Was this written before or after?
Well, the sages provided their interpretations after the time of David. So they did have the benefit of hindsight, if you will, of knowing.
Who wrote Deuteronomy?
Who wrote Deuteronomy? The short answer is the book of Deuteronomy is the book that God wants us to have in its totality. Exactly what date it was published is a whole nother conversation, and we'll leave that for another time. But it's considered and it takes its place as the final book of the Torah. And whether or not our ancestors would have been able to look into the book of Deuteronomy and say 14 years at Gilgal, probably not. They would not have been able to use this to predict where they would be, but they could use this to predict if we're in the land of Israel and it's during a time of unrest and conquest and fighting, then you can do these types of sacrifices in your own, but the others you still have to do at the altar. But if you're in the land of Israel and there's peace, then you need to go to the one and only place that's been picked. But only pick one and only place permanently when you've really been given peace on all sides from the nations that have been in Israel, even if you still have trouble with nations outside of Israel. And then that one becomes the place, full stop, which is what brings us to the year 2017, where we have only one place that sacrifices are permitted, and that one place currently doesn't have a temple standing on it, which means we don't offer sacrifices. So anybody who was really looking forward to going home and building an altar in their backyard, doesn't work. And besides, we live in Florida. There is no Bama. There is no high place. Mount Dora, I'm not even sure that counts. Yeah, that's true. Northern Florida, we can find some hills, but nowhere around here except Space Mountain. And I'm pretty sure they'd be upset if we put an altar on the top of Space Mountain. I think enough people already worship Disney. All right. So then let's get the summary. It is there. And this is from the last half of verse 11.
It is there that you shall bring. The discussion above concerns Shiloh, while the discussion here concerns Jerusalem. This is why Scripture separates them, by granting permission between them. From the time that Shiloh was laid waste, and they arrived at Nob, and Nob was laid waste, and they arrived at Gibeon, personal below were permitted, until they arrived at Jerusalem.
So this again goes back to our little chart of where you have that 57-year gap after the destruction of Shiloh and before Jerusalem was conquered and settled. That again, we had this special dispensation because it was a time of tumultuous conflict, and therefore it was not reasonable and not safe to expect people to come for things that they didn't have to make the trek. Because remember, when God told us you need to come to the place I pick for the festivals, I will protect you, we already had a guarantee of safety. But if it's just because I feel like offering something, I don't have a guarantee at that point. And therefore, it's better to stay and do the sacrifice in my own spot. Yes? Yes. Okay. So hopefully you found that very interesting. But let's come back to our question about how does this affect our spirituality, our desire for connection to God? Were the good times when we could offer it wherever we felt like, or were the good times when we could offer it only where God demanded it?
Well, more importantly, we don't have to sacrifice it. We can't sacrifice it. We don't have to sacrifice it anymore because we can't.
Oh, we living in our modern era absolutely cannot. Although, as we're going to see, there is a parallel to sacrifice that's very important for modern life. But within the sacrificial time, within the time that we're discussing here, which do you think would have been better, preferable? To just be able to offer the sacrifice wherever, or to only be able to offer it in the place, whether it be Shiloh or Jerusalem?
I think you have to go, at least I'd have to go with, you have a fixed place. Because you don't have a sense of community. You don't have a sense of nationhood. If everyone is spread out, sounds familiar. If everyone is spread out in their own little valley with their own little thing, you lose that. We had it when we were in the desert because the Mishkan was right there. We know we're people that have to have something right there, but we need to know where right there is.
So,
and I think we would have lost a sense of belonging to a greater nation or greater people.
So worshiping at a private altar may allow a connection to God to some degree, but it doesn't create the connection to the nation, which is supposed to then buttress our connection to God at the same time.
Exactly.
And so we needed that centralizing and cohesive building action of coming together. And we have a bit of a comparison, right? Because we know that there was another nation who had worship in the land of Canaan before we showed up. And how did they work?
Hilltop to hilltop.
Hilltop to hilltop, right? They had altars wherever you felt like, as we saw under any leafy tree or wherever they wanted. And those nations fell to us because they were not cohesive. When you look through the wars of Joshua and then the stories of the book of Judges, the Canaanites never stood as a unit against us. They were always city-state type arrangements, and the king of one was not trying to help the king of others. And we took them out basically piecemeal. We never once fought a battle of the Israelites versus all the Canaanites. We didn't do that. We did the battle of Israelites versus this city, the battle of Israelites versus that city. And there was no cohesion. There was no there, to quote a more modern phrase. And that gave us a decided edge when it came to the conflict that we had with them. And when were we most vulnerable? When we also lacked cohesion. Throughout the book of Judges, and then later throughout the rest of the stories of the kings, when Israel was most divided, both into north and south kingdoms, or divided even within themselves, that was when we were most vulnerable to invasion and destruction. And one of the great tragedies of the split between north and the south was the prevention of people from the north coming to the south in order to be able to be in Jerusalem for worship. Because obviously the northern kingdom didn't like that idea. So they went down the idolatry road as a substitute. Michael, you had?
I was going to say that centralized sacrifice allows for consistent ritual.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Right. But there is also something to be said that although doing it in your own backyard gives you a certain level of personalization and control, the consistency between my backyard and your backyard and his backyard might be lacking. And when it comes to making sure you're on the right path, making sure you're headed the right direction and not going off one way or the other, having that consistent experience and having that shared experience is very, very important. If you look at the bottom, we've got a few more little paragraphs here. And if we can get you just to read them, we're going to bring this up into the modern day without a sacrifice. What we still consider to be the time of sacrifice. 3
prayers are recited daily: the evening prayer, the morning prayer, and the Mincha prayer. There are 4 on Sabbaths, festivals, and Rosh Chodesh. The 3 that are recited daily and the Musaf prayer. these four and the.
Okay. Now, this numbering of the prayer services, which is being referred to really here as the Amidah, is the core of the prayer service that's being discussed, is parallel to the sacrificial services. Right? We offer our tefillah, our prayer, our Amidah, in the same points in the day and the same times in the calendar that a sacrifice would have been brought to the altar in Jerusalem. So our prayers are the sacrifices. They are the substitute, if you will. However, we have a little bit more detail here.
Prayers may not be diminished, but may be increased. If a person wants to pray all day long, he may. Any prayer that one adds is considered as a free will offering.
Remember we talked about those free will offerings when you could bring that at your own personal bama, but the other offerings you had to take to the altar, right? That's what's the comparison that's being done here. So you could sit and do the Amidah over and over and over and over again, far beyond the minimum 3 for an average day, and that's fine. It's a little bit difficult if you don't eat, sleep, or work, but barring those basic necessities of life, you can add an additional Amidah. If you feel excited about something and you just want to do the Amidah one more time to say to God, in addition to the regular ones you've asked me to do, I want to give you one more shout out with another Amidah, or there's something that's desperately needed, and I want to give one more Amidah as an additional spiritual offering. That is permitted. Keep going.
Any prayer that one adds is considered as a free will offering. Therefore, one must add a new idea consistent with that blessing in each of the middle blessings. Making an addition of a new concept, even in only one blessing, is sufficient in order to make known that this is a voluntary prayer and not obligatory. In the first 3 and last 3, one must never add, detract, or change anything at all.
Right. So the first 3 blessings of the Amidah and the last 3 blessings of the Amidah, we don't change any of the theme and content at all. Right. The form that was given to express that theme is what we keep to. There is some variation throughout history of exactly how that's worded, but what is attempted by those words never changes. The middle blessings, however, if you're doing a free will offering, you're welcome to use, for example, on a weekday, the standard 13 blessings in the middle, but you better include an additional idea in at least one of them in order that this is now a new prayer, that this is something reflecting of a new idea, a new feeling within you, which has demanded you to now express yourself in tefillah. So here is your backyard bama, your backyard altar, and your own personalization and improvisation of exactly how you want to word, say, and reflect this. So that's in a remarkably flexible way of continuing to have that personal spiritual experience. However,
the community should not recite a voluntary prayer, since the community does not bring a free will offering.
If we're talking about the congregation, we as a congregation don't say we're going to have an additional Amidah this coming Shabbat, right? Because the community doesn't do that. The individual, moved personally, can give additionally. The community is the standard as a group together. That's our cohesiveness. But the individual expression gets added on top of that cohesiveness. So notice the pattern here, right? We're not taking away from the cohesion. We add only ourselves to it. It's not that individual and community are in opposition. They are cumulative, but both parts are needed. It can't only be the individual doing just whatever he or she feels like. And it isn't supposed to be just the community and the individual is subsumed into that and never has room for their own expression. It is the individual joins to make the community, and then through the community not only has that binding effect, but rises higher as well and has opportunity for personal improvisation, addition, and spiritual expression. Make sense?
So what you're basically saying is that a free will or an extension of
Mm-hmm.
your daily prayer is within the context of the Amidah.
Exactly.
There's nothing outside of that that would be incorporated in your own.
It absolutely can be, right? So if you wish to do an additional thanksgiving. You know, you see a beautiful cloud formation and you want to thank God for this beautiful beauty of creation. No problem. And then there are indeed many blessings that we can do that are already written for experiencing certain special circumstances. If you want to sit and be in prayerful contemplation and prayer as you think about God, or consider the story of our people, or the teachings of our sages, that's also permitted. But if you want to do something that would be the equivalent of offering a free will sacrifice in Jerusalem, then the Amidah is the vehicle for doing so, if you are willing to express it differently than the regular Amidah that we do. If you are willing to make some distinction, and that's demanding of change rather than, you know, prohibiting change. It's saying you've got to make this different if you're really trying to say something new. So I know it's harder for us, I think, to imagine why would I ever want to do something that was similar to an offering in the temple. But on the other hand, I think it's a very powerful and profound statement that although we don't have the temple and an altar there, I can still do something that is every bit as powerful as what our ancestors felt the sacrifices afforded them. That I may not be in Jerusalem and we may not have the temple, but this vehicle is still alive and well and able to transport me if I'm willing to take it and make it mine, as opposed to just doing what's important, which is the cohesive community prayer. If I want to make it mine, I do need to add something of myself into it. I can't just ride the community coattails forever. Comment?
Yeah, I'm thinking of all the poetry
Mm-hmm.
from the Middle Ages, all the
Piyutim.
Piyutim. I mean, there's just a whole mass of
Mm-hmm.
poetry, creating poetry that was added to the service.
More than the Siddur itself. I mean,
Yes.
more than the original core of the service
Yes.
itself.
And unfortunately, in some cases, unless, you know, you want to spend endless hours in service, those are gradually being taken out. And sometimes I feel very bad because they are individual poetry of prayer given free.
But that's exactly why, unfortunately and fortunately, the number of them need to be reduced. Which is, if you take what was an individual's outpouring of his or her own soul, and you make all of those outpourings now fixed parts of the service, then there becomes less and less time for the current individual to express themselves, because they're so consumed with trying to get through what is written on every single page and get it done before the night's over.
I did mention that.
But that's the challenge, is taking the guidance from those who have come before us and using their words as inspiration and saying, this helps me also find my own words. And having so many words that are added beyond what the minimum is required, that there's now no room for my words, or no feeling that my words matter, which is the even bigger shame, is that people think you had to have been a great poet to have words that would matter before God, which is not true. It's nice to be a great poet, and certainly it helps you formulate thoughts in more beautiful and elegant ways, but that's not the requirement of what a free will sacrifice would be.
Does this relate to the line in Psalms, sing a new song to the
Mm-hmm.
Lord?
Right, Shir Chadash, right? A new song. We should constantly be looking for opportunities and ways to express new ideas, new celebrations, new thanksgiving, new praise of God. But many of us feel that we're running through the motions of just doing the required, or what we think is the required, that we have no time or inspiration to then be able to say what's new.
Is that maybe the reason that these new Siddurim had the sidebars and, you know, I wouldn't equate them to prayers, but yes, it is prayerful and inspirational.
Yes.
To read supplementary, you know, ideas alongside the standard.
Exactly right. The prayers themselves were never meant to be, as I often say, a straitjacket for our thoughts. They are meant to be the launch pad for our thoughts. They're a ladder that we climb. They aren't boxes that we just tick off. And so having the additional sidebars in the Lev Shalem are there to help us look at the same prayer in different ways. Because you might have 2, 3, 4 sometimes for one prayer or one page of a prayer that have different ideas that these authors have found were parallel, or at least were inspired by the text of the prayer itself. And then when we pray, we're not supposed to just add that new author's additional idea. We're supposed to realize that we're now able to take our own ideas like those other authors and have those feelings within us as well, and add them to our own words inside that prayer while we are davening. And if you don't have a chance to have a new idea come into your head, and even maybe reach your lips while you're davening, then you are missing out on one of the most powerful and important parts of prayer. And you're still doing the minimum, and yasher koach, that's great, of doing the prayer as it's on the page. But that is not the goal. That is the starting place. You haven't hit the finish line. You've just begun by doing what's on the page. It's got to move you to find new words. And then there's just one more line about we don't do the musaf because the musaf was really a community obligation rather than voluntary. But that we don't need to go into more than that. We'll leave it there. All right. Thank you very much.
Cool.